Let's get started then. If you would like to introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about your decision to study at Fudan.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm Arno. I'm a French-born New Zealander, and my decision to study in China was pretty straightforward. I was studying architecture at my university at the time, and I came to realize we weren't learning anything about anyone else. We were studying quite accurately America and England and most of New Zealand, but generally speaking, the other was always left out. So on my fifth year, when I was given the opportunity to make a choice as to what I wanted to look into, naturally I was drawn to Asia, and I accidentally fell into China. So studying Chinese architecture in
Wow.
general gave me a bit of an understanding, but I realized quite quickly that without the language or without even a cursory understanding of the culture, it was almost impossible to begin to start to wade through the plethora of information and cultural epithets in the area. So uh, a teacher friend of mine told me that maybe what I should do is just go to China. And so I applied for a scholarship, and with luck, as luck would have it, I got it, and suddenly in China.
That's really just amazing to me because of course my decision was so just I just want to go to China. There was no further like thought involved to have it. I mean, has it obviously we're in very difficult times right now, but do you think it's going to find a way into your career?
I've always wanted it to. I mean, since I've been back, regardless of the current political and social climate, I've always been interested in returning. My work in architecture tended more towards research, and so it never really focused on any of the political or social issues. So I was always interested in going there, learning the language, talking to people about their day-to-day lives and determining how that influenced architecture and how those things have influenced us. Because despite what people think of New Zealand, the country actually has a very deep history and a deep connection with China. My city alone was built on the backs of Chinese immigrants who came here in the 1840s and 60s for the gold rush. So we cannot really separate the influence that China has had on myself, not to mention my country. And so it's always seemed to me like the necessary step. And if you look at economics in general, as some people often do, China tends to have a, a hold over us in terms of the economy and production. And so learning the language and spending time over there could only be helpful, at least for myself. So that's sort of how I looked at it.
Makes sense. Yeah. So, correct me if I'm wrong. You didn't have hardly any Chinese language education before getting to Shanghai, right?
Yeah, I once I got the scholarship, I sat in some Chinese classes for about 10 weeks just to get an idea of what I was going to find myself in. It helped in a sense. I learned a few words, I began to understand some of the sounds, but generally speaking, I arrived there with no support structure or background information.
Right. And so you spent a whole year there, correct?
Yeah, just over a year.
So how would you describe your experience going into the entry level classes and how much you learned over the course of that year?
I'd say it's probably unquantifiable the amount I've learned. In terms of the language, I crossed four levels. It's not an official amount, so it's not the HSK level system, but theoretically speaking, it crosses between the three and four levels. So it can be quantified in an educational sense, but in terms of what I was able to learn about myself, about society, about culture, and about people in general, I think is unquantifiable, as I stated before. It's it's interesting because when I first arrived, the first few weeks, I obviously spoke no Chinese, and sometimes I wonder how I even made it through. I had to get a phone, start a bank account, just organize internet, get into my apartment, start organizing my classes, enroll, and these sorts of things are crazy. So I arrived with no formal support structure, and somehow I managed my way through. And I think that that's a lot of how China expects you to learn the language is to just be thrown in. And so arriving at entry level Chinese at Fudan University was not what you'd expect entry level Chinese to be at home university. Within a week, we'd covered more than an entire semester's work. They expected us to memorize the entirety of the pinyin system within 3 days and had already expected us to have learnt about 100 characters by that time. So I think the first thing I noticed was that at least the way in which they expected you to learn the language was pure recall. It's you don't learn the rules at first. They teach you how to memorize things, and then they expect you to do that. So by the end, you're supposed to have learnt over 1,000 characters, which doesn't seem like much if you take into consideration that each character is maybe a word. But from a system that doesn't use pure memorization and prefers to teach you how to learn, it comes off as a bit of a Herculean task.
Right. So going off of that, how would you compare, your classroom and the teaching styles to what you were used to in New Zealand?
I guess when it comes to university, I don't think it was too different. I got the impression that the classes at university in China were tailored towards a more foreign education system. I don't feel, at least when it came to the conversations I had with Chinese students and Chinese friends, it seemed a little less standard. We seemed to be catered to because of our foreign tendencies or foreign sensibilities. So it wasn't too difficult to jump in, but at the same time, it's a lot about speed. So when it comes to something in the West, at least the way I've experienced it, a lot of the time you're pushed through and you're helped through every step of the way. My experience of China is that if you fall behind, you're done. You got to catch up, you got to keep up, or you're out.
Yeah, I think that's a very apt way to put it. So let's see. What about outside of the classroom? What were your travel experiences and recreation and just living in the city?
I mean, it's interesting because I come from a country that has, as of the recent census, 5 million people, and I was finding myself in a place of 26 million. So it could be said that it was as far from what I was used to as possible. My home city has 125,000 people on a good day. So it was interesting, but I found that there was a sort of a sense of safety I found in the large crowds in places like Shanghai because as much as people try to fight against it, for me the idea of being a faceless mass gave anonymity and as a result security. So it was an interesting experience to feel that no one noticed you, no one really even cared about you, which I think is what a lot of people are fighting against. But for me, as a person who is just like many people of my generation, especially in my country, feeling a sense of ennui with my own home country, there was something freeing about that. And so I really actually enjoyed living in these sorts of deep and thoroughly dense places. That being said, whenever I had the chance, I did travel. China is such a large country and has such a diverse uh, set of people and a diverse culture and also a diverse environment. So whenever I had a chance, I went out. And I'm a bit of a hiking nut, so I ended up doing 5 sacred mountains, things like that. And so I for me that was something that really resonated. But I guess the major, well, I wouldn't say issue, but part of what made that interesting is that I come, like I said, I come from a small country that also deals a lot in extreme sports and hiking and mountaineering. But when you do that, you're alone, as perhaps Americans might attest if they're ever in the national parks. China, you're never alone. Wherever you are, you could be 3,000 meters up on a sacred mountain, you could be 6 hours deep into a forest, you could be getting lost in a cave. There's a million people, tourists, locals, people selling you something, people scamming you. There's people everywhere, and you can't get away from it.
Yeah, that was. I'll say that was largely my experience as well, and it's. I don't know. There's something special about having all of these amazing experiences be very accessible. I felt like the hikes that I did, it was really nice that it feels like a lot of people had access to them. But at the same time,
Oh,
sometimes you
absolutely.
just want to get away and feel like you're in the wilderness.
Yeah, I mean, I had a perfect example. I was climbing Omeishan, which is in the Sichuan province, and it was about a 12-hour hike, and so we'd stayed over in a monastery. And most of the hike, myself and my partner had been alone. And it was during the week. We were hiking at say between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning at times, and so we was no one around. We were pretty used to the solitary nature of this hike. But upon arriving at the summit, we were greeted by, I don't know, I'd say the entire population of my country, and and it's because there's a cable car, and so that accessibility is great, but you often find yourself a little struck by the sudden crowds at places that in your own country might be considered remote.
Certainly. Yeah, and as somebody who likes to do a lot of hiking as well, it almost, I don't want to say it cheapens the experience because obviously, your accomplishment isn't cheapened by someone else just getting to the top. But it does feel a little bit weird to come off of a long hike and somebody's just there.
Yeah, for sure. I think it changes the experience in a sense because while your own personal achievement is something, it also leads to a lot more person to person interaction, which in general isn't what people are looking for when they go for wilderness hikes. Generally, that's a person looking for themselves or reconnecting with nature, which you can do in this sense, but it requires a little bit more, I don't know, self-reflection in that case. In China, you're always
Hmm.
going to be bumping into people, and despite what people think of Chinese people, a lot of them are quick to laugh and quick to conversation when they see a foreigner might come and ask and talk and in many cases take a photo of you. If you're like me, tall, fair-skinned, and with a giant beard, you're in everyone's photos all around the country.
Certainly. Yeah, and as far as nature goes, I was pleasantly surprised with how much greenery there was in and around Shanghai.
Yeah, I mean, Shanghai's a very modern city, and they've been taking a lot of steps into making sure that it follows the plans that they have for environmentally friendly energy and approaches. And I know that when I was in Nanjing, it's a similar sense. I'm not sure about Beijing. I haven't been there myself, but I think that some of these super modern cities that are the sort of the seat of economy and business are becoming more and more green in a sense, and I think it's nice. I think it was nice. Um, that being said, there's also a lack of animals. You don't really see birds and you don't really hear insects.
Well,
Something
plenty of
that when you're from
strays.
where I'm from, it's everywhere.
Yeah. Well, and that's something to me that was amazing about food on campus. Do you remember the birds on campus? They were just,
Yeah,
you'd
I
hear
do.
them
Yeah,
all the time.
all the time. Yeah, in the trees and all that. And I think that that's one of the reasons a lot of people came there, like non-students. Well, that's
Yeah.
not to mention the cats.
Oh, there were plenty of cats.
The scourge of the foreign dormitories.
Certainly. So overall, I mean, how would you rate your experience? Like, would you do it again? Was it positive? Do you recommend it?
Yeah, I mean, recommended is difficult because I think you have to be in a certain state of mind in order to approach going to a place like China. I've had many conversations with my friends and my family since my return about the place, and for me, the experience was overwhelmingly positive. But I do warn that it's not an easy place to get into. I think it requires a certain state of mind, a certain ability to just let things go, especially in the first few months. You're going to be faced with things that will challenge your general concept of morality, of society, and just general decency. And these things are not an affront to those, but as a result, if you don't learn to let some things go and understand that this is a different culture, a different group, you're going to find yourself struggling and at times even resenting the people there. And I think that's the first step down to hate.
Certainly. And I know culture shock is a big topic of debate. And when I was talking with Danny during our recording, we talked also about how the fact that neither one of us, especially myself, had never lived in any sort of city before. So that was almost as big of a culture shock as being in
Country
China,
boys.
was being in this huge metropolitan, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't really lived in a
Mm.
big city like this either.
Well,
I mean,
that
I come
was
from a very small country, but I had traveled quite a bit. So the shock, I guess, was specific to China and not so much about the fact that it was a place that was different. I've traveled quite extensively, but as I often say, China is not easy mode traveling. Yeah, it's about as difficult as it gets before going into places that are truly remote. It's one of the few places I've been to that has the infrastructure that it has, but also happens to be one of the more complicated places to get around, particularly alone. And if you don't speak the language, which luckily enough we were learning, you find yourself blocked in many areas.
Certainly, it's not a place to just show up unprepared. But I think, especially if you're just planning on staying in and around Shanghai, it's very easy to just explore and get lost and find yourself again. And
Oh, certainly. Shanghai is a very well manicured and organized city, and so yeah, if you're staying in that area, it's not that complicated. But the moment you step out of the orchestrated areas, if you step outside of the big cities and you try to go into the small areas, start to see some of the more what friends of mine have called the real China, you find yourself lost like you would in any country that speaks a foreign language. I've been to Japan myself, and while Tokyo is famous for being perhaps one of the most easy cities to be a tourist in, the moment you step out, you find these places are not built for tourists, which is fine. And in fact, that's the reason you go there. But you'll often find yourself a little lost.
certainly, well, this was a lot of really, really good information. And I think we should take a couple minutes to maybe share a story or two about some of the adventures we had while we were in Shanghai as a kind of a. So I don't know, anything that comes to mind of things that we did?
I mean, I mean, we've done a lot of stuff. I mean, it's interesting because when you look at the size of China, you get the impression that you've done nothing. But we did travel quite a bit, not as much as we would have liked as we were studying, but we did go around quite a bit. I mean, even just in China alone, one of the sort of the odd experiences I've had was, like I said, I'm a bearded individual, and so where I'm from, that's very normal. And so I wasn't really aware of the effect it was having on locals at the time. And an example was that one of the days, which is rare in Shanghai at times, the pollution wasn't really visible, and so the sun was shining, and people were flocking to the Bund to take photos. And so I, as a like-minded individual, did the same. Found myself there, and I was there with what appeared to be budding photographers, many of them with their tripods and their super cameras and telephotographic lenses. And upon my arrival, I assumed someone noticed me, and all the cameras turned on me. So in the back, there's this beautiful scenery of Japan or of China, sorry, of Shanghai, everything that you could possibly want in a place that usually has a high pollution level. And these all these cameras, like paparazzi, were looking at me and taking photos of me, and people were lining up and asking me to take selfies with them. And this was probably within the first month of my arrival, and I could tell you it was surprising.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this. Um, and yeah, if there's,
No,
unless
no,
there's
no
anything else
problem
you
at
want to
all.
say, I
It's
think
always
that's
fun to
our.
talk about it.
Well, thanks so much.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.